hardly anyone could have failed to notice. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has completely altered the nature of European energy security. It has shown the strategic vulnerability and risk of our continued dependency on Russian fossil fuel imports. But how dependent are we? What is our exit strategy? And how vigilant should we be, given fears of new dependencies being created through the energy transition? This is what we will be explaining today.
First, let's take a look at Europe's fossil fuel imports and usage compared to other energy sources. According to the latest EU statistics, in 2020, so prior to the Russian war in Ukraine, the EU energy mix looked like this. Oil accounted for 36%, natural gas for 25%, both coal and nuclear for 11% respectively, and renewables stood at approximately 18%. In 2020, the overall EU dependency rate was equal to 58%. This means that more than half of the EU energy needs were met by net imports. Across the member states, the import dependency rate ranged from over 90% in Malta, Cyprus and Luxembourg to only 10% in Estonia. Before the war, Russia was the EU leading supplier of oil, natural gas and coal. In total, Russian energy imports accounted for approximately a quarter of all European energy consumption in 2020.
Over-reliance on Russian energy is the most important example of a security threat coming from a fossil fuel or energy dependency. This is mainly because of the geopolitical leverage it gives Moscow over other European countries. But the EU also imports fossil fuels from other illiberal countries, such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Azerbaijan. If the interests of such a state and the EU do not align, then energy supplies could become a geopolitical lever to exert pressure on the bloc. Such countries are often labeled as petrostates. These are nations whose economy is heavily dependent on the extraction and export of fossil fuels such as natural gas and oil. A common symptom is that the wealth and power generated from the revenues of fossil fuel is often concentrated in the hands of a few. This can weaken and erode the institutions of the state. Buying oil and gas from these countries means that the EU could be indirectly funding these illiberal regimes. In turn, this could help facilitate the use of violence and repression against their respective populations. Countries which export fossil fuels are often economically undiversified. This means that any changes in global pricing and export volumes could have impacts on their political stability. This can lead to social unrest or even civil strife. Just look at the Arab Spring. Europe is heavily exposed to any price shocks, supply disruptions, or negative effects of a spillover of such unrest or conflict. European countries have responded to the current crisis with gas-saving measures and a quicker rollout of renewable energy, amongst other interventions. At the same time, the EU has looked towards illiberal petrostates like Azerbaijan and Qatar. With the help of these countries, the EU hopes to fill the void left by Russia, despite the obvious geopolitical risks. This would indicate that the EU is not yet able to shed its dependency from these countries. On the other hand, the EU also imports fossil fuels from democratic countries. For example, Norway supplied the EU 21% of its gas and 9% of its oil in 2020. In the same year, the US supplied 9% of the EU's oil supply. Both countries have agreed to expand their exports to the EU in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This shows that there is an effort to reduce exposure to illiberal petrostates.
But in the long run, can other energy sources replace our dependency on fossil fuels? The EU has pledged to grow its renewable generation target to 45% by 2030. Policymakers have a variety of replacement options, some more green than others. Examples are solar energy, wind power, geothermal energy, which is heat generated from deep within the earth, biomass and biofuels, which involve the burning or fermentation of organic materials such as plant and wood, nuclear energy, and hydrogen, an innovative clean energy carrier that can be used as fuel to power electric cars, for example, and can be produced from a variety of sources, such as wind and solar. But none of these options are a silver bullet. They all have their pros and cons, and there is a lively debate around each and every one of them. Individually, they cannot meet our energy demand and climate ambitions simultaneously. Therefore, a combination would always be necessary.
So can renewable sources replace fossil fuels entirely? Well, in the short term, the answer is no. Russian energy accounted for 155 billion cubic meters of natural gas last year. Proposed replacement measures by the end of 2022 account for approximately 102 billion cubic meters annually, creating a shortfall. This also assumes that new energy sources, like green hydrogen, can become viable quickly, which is quite distant from the reality on the ground. However, in the medium to long term, there is a possibility that renewable energy could become the largest single source of EU energy consumption. But fossil fuel will still be needed in the production of certain renewable energy technologies and components, necessitating continued import partnerships, particularly of natural gas and hydrogen.
The irony of the energy transition is that the EU will still have critical dependencies on other countries. The systems powered by green energy, such as solar panels, wind farms, and electric cars, all require critical raw materials whose processing is dominated by one specific player, China. China fulfills 90% of the rare earth element demand and 80% of the solar panel demand of the EU. This presents a critical vulnerability for Europe because any further tension or worsening of the diplomatic relation with Beijing may lead China to reduce or even cut off these supplies. This would jeopardize the energy transition in Europe and impact our energy security. To avoid this scenario, the EU wants to expand partnerships on these critical raw materials with countries it deems to have a common interest with, such as Ukraine and Canada. However, China already controls most of the global clean energy supply chain. In the case of solar panels, this includes raw materials, processed materials, components, and assembly.
As such, the EU needs to empower private enterprises to expand their global footprint within all facets of the value chain. This will take a huge amount of time, resources, and coordination. It would take a securitization of critical raw materials, meaning that the stability of supply would be a national and bloc-wide competency. This could be achieved through the EU Commission's newly proposed Critical Raw Materials Act, but details are not yet clear. Finally, there is likely not a future scenario where the EU could truly achieve strategic autonomy in this field. Therefore, it should look to sharpen its own geopolitical levers, namely the strength of its private sector, to help bring balance to the overall trade relationship.
It is pretty clear. The clock is ticking to create and secure our new energy mix. Do you want to know more about our latest research on energy security? Visit our Europe in the World page on the Cleanel website.